Welcome to Module 2, Social Tools Overview. In this session, we're going to talk about the broader use of social networking technologies in K-12 virtual education and begin to explore strategies for how to use them. This module is separate from a second module which will dig into lesson examples using very specific social networking technologies. I am going to assume, though, going into this module, that you are looking to implement virtual teaching, so teaching at a complete distance or at least fairly blended, and that you're working with students 13 and older. I apologize for my teachers out there that are taking this course that work with students younger than 13, but the trick, as we all know, with social networking technologies is legally you need to be 13 or older to participate in the majority of them. There are some out there that are specific to younger kids, but they're not really social tools per se. I would say a lot of times they fall more into the games category, and we'll talk about them later on. But yes, this really is about students that are 13 and older in most cases. Now, in some of these technologies that we'll talk about, and as you can see here, you're going to see a list of social networking and sharing tools out there. In some of these, there are ways to get private licenses for your school or district, and so you might want to investigate that if you're really interested in doing this with younger children. I do know that there are kids under 13 that are using things like Twitter and Facebook and Pinterest and Instagram, but in order to really support this in an effective and secure way for your students, I do encourage you to stick to the 13 years or older. At least in the US. I know in some other countries there might even be older age restrictions. Now you know your social networking technologies, the Twitters and the Facebooks. You also have tools that support blogs and wikis, things like a Tumblr or a Blogger or WordPress or Wikispace. These I would also categorize as social networking tools or social technologies because they're about social content creation or social feedback generation, or even crowdsourcing around content. And so we're going to lump all of these together as we think about how we may use social technologies in our K-12 virtual classroom. So when might you want to use a social networking technology? And when would it be good to use one? I highly encourage you to only use a social technology when you've personally used it. You don't necessarily have to have used it in a professional environment, but you personally should be experienced with it. Because as you'll learn, and as we all know, they all have their differing style, and they all have their strengths and weaknesses, or the areas where you could get in trouble in how you might want to use it, not official trouble, but it might be difficult for you to use it with students because of some of the stylistic approaches to that technology. So it's definitely something that you should have used. You should also be fluent in all of the privacy statements and terms of use. Make sure, because the majority of these social networking technologies are cloud-based, they are public with private spaces. You can have private spaces in them. And I made sure to only address the ones that are available for private spaces. But you still want to be completely fluent in privacy because you want to make sure you understand what your students are signing up for and make sure that the data privacy associated with these technologies maps what your school or district requires. So make sure you're fluent in that. You also want to make sure that there's a real learning objective behind using it. Often I hear from teachers, I really want to figure out how to use Facebook because students are always on Facebook. That's not necessarily a good reason to use it. A good reason would be, I need to find a way where I can regularly communicate with my students how the scientific world impacts their everyday lives. And so I'm going to post on Facebook every single day a post for my students in a private group where they can see something around them and I'm reflecting on the science in that. That's a great use of a Facebook, as opposed to I want to use Facebook because everybody's in Facebook. So you want to make sure there's a clear learning objective that's measurable, that is purposeful with social interaction, that there's not a better way or a better technology to use it. It's actually a social activity. So if you're thinking about that teacher that's posting a picture of how science impacts their world one every day, and then all the students commenting on that, that's a social activity. And that's a social technology fits that really nicely. You also want to make sure with that learning objective that it's better designed that way than it would be in any other environment. Is it better to post that picture, that science picture, to a private Facebook group for your students to see as opposed to an asynchronous discussion in your learning management system? Or as opposed to a short video that you take that you post to students every day in your learning environment? You also want to make sure it's age appropriate. Some tools, even though it's 13 and up, are better for the 13-year-olds, and some are better for the 18-year-olds. So you want to think about what's age appropriate, or even older than that. So for example, Instagram tends to relate to the younger range of the 13 and up, and things like Pinterest. I don't know if your students have ever probably used Pinterest, although they could. They may have, but not a lot of kids use Pinterest, but it can be a really valuable social tool. So think about how age appropriate it is and how experienced your students might be with those technologies. And then finally, you want to make sure you have really, really great examples. And you want to be able to take those examples and translate them for students so that they can see what is a good post, what is good interaction, how are we going to be using this, why is this valuable. Be as explicit about that as possible for students so they get a sense of, okay, I understand the behavior from a learning perspective that I should be exhibiting in using one of these technologies, especially if it's a technology they use in their personal lives. And then last, make sure that you use any of these technologies, at least this is my recommendation, in a finite amount of time. And I say that because if we leave something open-ended, like post to Facebook whenever you see something cool that's science related, if students feel as though there isn't a need to do it right away, or if they feel like it's kind of never ending, they're going to eventually drop off in engagement. But if you make something finite in time, okay, this next month is about science in our everyday lives. I encourage everybody to post every day a picture that relates to science in your life, and then comment on how it relates to that. Well, it's a month, you could have a challenge, you could make it a game, who's posted, how many pictures, who's commented, you could do fun things with that, and it's finite in time and it keeps them engaged. Now, when not, or when should you avoid using a social technology? Definitely, I would suggest not using a social technology when it requires students to publicly share any of their content or personal information. Now, you can use one, and I've seen teachers do this great, where students can voluntarily share and get feedback from people beyond the students in their class. But requiring that puts your students at a risk, and it's challenging oftentimes with parents, because parents have differing values on when and how their kids should use social technologies, and you don't want to disrupt those necessarily. So avoid it when you have to publicly share content. It's okay if it's optional. And you probably want to avoid it when there's mixing. So if you're going to have students use Facebook, for example, they probably use it personally. Maybe not, though. It's starting to get less trendy with our younger kids. But let's say they are using it personally. If they are, you want to have a clear separate group or space in Facebook for students to interact so that their social and their personal aren't mixing, so that you can't possibly have some sort of weirdness happen with what your students might be sharing personally versus in the learning environment. Same holds true for you. One of a funny story that a teacher told me, maybe not so funny, is they weren't careful with where they posted a post about a family vacation. It was a safe post, but they posted a post about a family vacation that wasn't meant for their students that all of their students got, because it was so easy to accidentally do that. So be careful when you're using the social technologies, or don't use one when you could easily make that mistake. You also want to be really careful when technologies are limited to specific devices, because not all students may be working from those particular devices. So make sure that if you're using a social technology in particular, it works across platforms or devices that your students may have. And of course, and this goes without saying, you want to make sure that you are not using a social technology when it actually does not improve results. And I say this not because it's obvious, but because you should want to make sure that you're evaluating how well did using that social technology actually improve results. Question yourself and ask your students and monitor their work to make sure it's having the right impact. Now, the last thing that I will say that you may want to be careful of, it may not be a reason not to use social technologies, but you want to be careful of, is parent involvement. I actually suggest that you let your parents know up front, like either at a parent night or in an email or however you can communicate with your parents, that you are having students use a particular social technology in a specific way. Because like I said before, some parents have very specific values around how kids should be participating, how their children should use those tools, and you want to make sure that it's not conflicting with that, or that parents understand that it's not just about being social or play, but there's real learning value behind what they're doing. Now, how about effectiveness? How effective, or how can you be most effective in utilizing these social technologies? First and foremost, I encourage you to use them for more than just text. Now in Twitter, it's text, and we'll talk about that. But where you can bring in visual, video, photos, it can be enriching, it's a better use of a social technology. And you want to make sure that that use of that technology matches the style of that technology. So it makes sense in a Facebook environment to maybe have a little more thoughtful, multimedia-rich posts. In a Twitter environment, it's short, 140 characters or less comments, and that might make more sense in a question-answer or a brainstorming session. You do want to still keep it social. So the fun part about social technologies is they're social. So make sure you're creating activities where it makes a difference that students interact with each other and socialize, and that it's not something that students could do individually, but you're now suddenly having them use that social technology for. And finally, as I mentioned before, be careful with devices. Most social technologies are easier with mobile, so make sure that your students have access to mobile devices if it makes sense. Things like, especially if you want to try to take pictures or videos or just-in-moment kind of activities, it makes sense to have a tablet or a phone or some kind of mobile device for that. So I encourage you to make sure that students have access to that technology and to take advantage of that. Last, make sure that you're encouraging of students, and that just as you would be with a synchronous or an asynchronous discussion, that you promote an understanding and a collaboration and a community sense among your students, and that it's not about this either competition or who's right or who's wrong environment, that it's about the community and the interaction, and encourage that as best you can. Part of that will be making sure that students feel like they have an opportunity to be creative and to be personal and to reflect. So build that in. Now, what about efficiency? So I often get asked, okay, I'm going to do this, but I can't keep up with it. How do I keep up with all these hundreds of posts, or do I have to respond to everything? And the question is no, you don't have to respond, and you can crowdsource your support. So if students are having issues with material in your class, or if they're having issues with the technology itself, get them to help each other and to use that tool in that way. Step back and wait for somebody else to respond before you're the first to jump in there and respond. Make sure you separate personal and school, and we talked about that, and then make sure that you are visible, but make that visibility short and frequent as opposed to long and once a week. So you want to be in there often, but be in there for very short periods of time, and be consistent and be explicit with your students when and how you will respond or engage or participate in those social communities that you're encouraging. Last, use technologies out there that are your friends, like subscription technologies, filtering and aggregation technologies, things like a Hootsuite, where you can get all of your social technologies in one space. Find the best that work for you so that you don't feel like you're constantly strapped to checking all sorts of different environments, especially if you're using multiple environments, but that you keep it all together. And on our resources list for this week, I have a number of those good aggregation and filtering resources for you. Now let's think about what we've just talked about and how it might impact your own teaching. So let's say you've decided to have your students use blogs. Maybe you teach a writing class or a class that's more oriented towards writing essays or original work. So let's say you're doing that and you want students to use blogs as a way to get feedback in the development process of their writing. What would you want to make sure you do, and what would you want to make sure you avoid?